When you think about it, intelligence agencies, it's kind of like there's always this cloud of mystery, right? Like whispers and secrets and all that. But I got to say, in the Balkans, it feels like it's even more intense, you know. And you've brought in this whole stack of research on Serbian intelligence specifically.
Yeah.
And it seems like to really get into it, we need to rewind the clock a bit and talk about Yugoslavia and the UDBA.
Yeah, that's right. To understand Soviet intelligence today, you really have to go back to UDBA and its reign.
And it's still felt today, right?
Yeah.
What I'm gathering from all this is that UDBA wasn't just like any other agency. These guys were notorious.
Absolutely. I mean, imagine, if you will, like a Balkan KGB.
Oh, wow.
But even more ruthless. I mean, that's saying something, right?
Yeah.
Born out of these partisan groups from World War II, UDBA sought absolute control. We're talking like surveillance on an incredible scale, silencing any dissent, operations that went way beyond Yugoslavia's borders.
I think that's what I find so crazy about all this, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't just about like Cold War spying and all that. They were brutal.
Yeah.
Like their tactics, they were ruthless. What was it about this group that made them so intense?
That's a great question. And I think, part of it might be just, the brutal conditions of their formation out of the war.
Right.
These were groups that were fighting for survival, and that ruthlessness kind of got baked into their DNA, right? And so you have UDBA that kind of sees enemies everywhere, internally, externally, and acted very much with I would say, a chilling pragmatism.
Yeah.
A good example of this is the assassination of Stepan Jurakovic in Germany back in '83.
Oh, you mean the Croatian businessman?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, that case is one of those ones where it always seemed like, what happened?
Exactly, shrouded in mystery, right?
Mm.
So Jurakovic had exposed some corruption in Yugoslavia's oil industry, and he had fled the country. And so his assassination, which was orchestrated by UDBA, was very much a message, a very brutal attempt to silence dissent even beyond their borders.
Wow.
But it really backfired.
Because it didn't stay quiet, right?
Yeah.
It's amazing to me how a case that happened decades ago can still have these ripple effects.
This is the thing about it, this unsolved murder, it really cast a long shadow over Croatia for years.
Oh, I bet.
Because they were haunted by this connection to UDBA, especially as they were trying to join the EU. And it took immense international pressure.
Yeah.
But a key suspect was finally extradited to Germany in 2014.
So this wasn't just about, like, taking out a threat. This was about sending a message.
Control.
Yeah, control, even decades later.
Power.
What does that tell us about how UDBA operated even back then?
I think the Jurakovic case really underscores this chilling truth about UDBA, and that is they were not afraid to act, even on foreign soil. And those actions had very, very long-lasting consequences. It's a very stark reminder that in intelligence, the past really doesn't stay buried.
Because here's the thing. Yugoslavia collapses, and you think, okay, well, that's the end of that. But Serbian intelligence doesn't just disappear.
Right.
So what happens to all that? All those resources, all that infrastructure, do they just hit the reset button? I mean, Serbia has made a lot of progress democratically, right?
Right, and that's where the story takes a fascinating turn.
Right.
Because it's not a clean break. And it's not a straight line. It's more nuanced than that. Yeah, you're right. It's not like they just wiped the slate clean. It's not a clean break.
So what happens? I mean, they don't just swap out the letterhead at UDBA headquarters, right?
Not quite.
Okay.
But you're getting at something. Think about it. They inherited all of that infrastructure.
Right.
From UDBA. All those networks, the expertise. Imagine having decades worth of intelligence gathering, the who's who list, secrets, strategies. That's huge.
It's like inheriting like a library.
Right.
But instead of books, it's secrets.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, that's got to be valuable.
But here's where it gets weird, right?
Okay.
You have, on the one hand, this embrace of democratic ideals on the surface. But then underneath all of that, you still have this UDBA mentality, which is like a siege mentality.
So they think that there are always threats out there.
Yeah, and they have to be a step ahead. They have to be proactive.
Proactive seems like an understatement when we're talking about their history.
Right, right.
So are we talking about, like, are they still using those old Cold War tactics?
The world has changed a lot, you're right. Those old tactics are much riskier these days. But, that need to sort of control the story, to neutralize any threats, that's still there.
Okay, so how does that work in a modern democracy like Serbia? You mentioned this film, Družabni službenik, earlier.
State servant.
Yeah, does that give us any clues about this?
Yeah, it's fiction, but a lot of people see it as a reflection of how Serbian intelligence sees itself. the dangers they face, how much they sacrifice. It's an interesting window, whether it's accurate or not, into that UDBA influence.
So we have this country trying to embrace democracy, but they're still clinging to this, like, totalitarian past.
It's a contradiction, yeah.
It really is. And this is where things start to get even more interesting, I think, geopolitically.
Yeah.
Because we have to talk about Russia.
Right.
Russia's influence is everywhere.
Of course.
So is this Serbian influence we're seeing in North Macedonia today, is it really just Russia pulling the strings?
Right. And that's the big question, right?
Yeah.
We have to be careful about connecting those dots too directly, though.
Okay.
Because while Serbia and Russia have a really deep relationship,
Historically and everything else, yeah.
it's not accurate to say that Serbia is just doing what Russia wants.
So there's more to it than that. They're not just a puppet of Russia.
It's much more complicated, yeah. They're walking a tightrope, trying to balance things between Russia and the West.
Give me an example. Like, how do they do that?
Look at their military partnerships, for example. They've got these joint exercises with Russia.
Okay.
They buy some equipment.
Right.
But at the same time, they're also making deals with China and even France recently for arms.
So they're keeping their options open?
They're hedging their bets. It's pragmatic.
So does that apply to intelligence too?
Very much so. Serbian intelligence, they're transactional.
What do you mean?
They'll cooperate with anyone, even if that country isn't on good terms with Russia, as long as it's good for Serbia. A good example is this Serbian military officer who was recently arrested. He was allegedly giving information to Russia, and it may have had something to do with Serbia selling arms to Ukraine.
Whoa. That is wild.
It's a high-stakes game.
That's crazy. So Serbian intelligence, they're not just a Russian proxy. They're playing their own game.
Exactly.
And that takes us back to that UDBA mentality.
Yeah.
It's amazing to me how that stuff still echoes today.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We're talking about a completely different world,
right,
and yet
still there
are these threads.
It's like this invisible force.
Absolutely.
One we can't ignore. And you brought up North Macedonia earlier.
Right.
And that seems like a perfect example of all this.
Yes.
So we have this invisible force, this UDBA mentality, and it's still echoing today. And you brought up North Macedonia earlier, and that seems like a perfect example of all this, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so help me understand this. We've got this idea of Serbian influence in North Macedonia. Everyone seems to be talking about it, but always kind of like under their breath, right?
Right. It's very much unspoken, you know?
But we've got to talk about it, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned this shared past, this history. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. It's not like, you know, this overt thing with, you know, tanks rolling across borders and things like that. This is much more subtle, much more in the shadows.
Right.
And you're not going to find, like, you know, clear-cut evidence, you know, smoking gun kind of thing. But it's the history. It's those personal connections, the relationships built during their time in Yugoslavia. That's what really lays the groundwork here.
Okay, so it's less about planting spies and more about just kind of like leveraging what's already there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Think of it as like soft power, but with an edge, you know?
Oh, I like that.
Not necessarily direct orders being given, but it's about shaping perceptions.
Yeah, okay.
Getting people to see things a certain way. It's about whispers in the right ear.
It's so interesting how these relationships from decades ago can still be so powerful.
Absolutely.
What's a good example of how this actually plays out in real life?
Well, there's this really interesting case. It involves this Macedonian politician named Ivan Stoilkovic.
Oh, right. Yeah, I read a little bit about him. He's a pretty high-ranking official, right?
Yeah, he's currently a deputy prime minister in the Macedonian government.
Wow. Okay.
But, and this is where it gets interesting, he was actually flagged by Macedonian intelligence.
Whoa. Wait, really? Their own intelligence?
Yeah, as a Serbian intelligence asset.
That's not even subtle.
No, not at all. And you can imagine this caused quite a reaction.
I bet.
But it just goes to show how deep some of these ties go. I mean, we're talking about Serbian intelligence operating potentially within the very structures of their neighbors.
That is really something. So we've talked about UDBA, we talked about this history, we've talked about these modern examples, and it all keeps leading back to one question, which is Russia, right?
Yeah.
I mean, given Serbia's relationship with Moscow, is this all just Russia pulling the strings in the region?
Right. It's the big question. It's what everyone wants to know, but I think we need to be careful about drawing a straight line between, like, Moscow to Belgrade to Skopje
Okay, so you're saying it's not that simple.
Not that simple. I mean, yes, Serbia and Russia, they have these very deep ties, historic, cultural, and yeah, those ties have gotten even stronger recently.
Especially lately, it seems like.
But to say that Serbia is just like a puppet of the Kremlin,
right,
I think that's a little too simplistic.
Okay, so Serbia's playing their own game here. But what does that mean? What are they trying to achieve?
Well, they're walking this tightrope, trying to keep things balanced between Russia and the West, and honestly, they're playing it pretty smart.
Give me an example. Like, how are they actually pulling that off?
Well, just look at how they handle their military relationships. I mean, yeah, they do joint exercises with Russia, and they buy some weapons from them.
Right.
But they also make deals with China.
Right.
And we just saw that whole thing with France buying arms from them, So
they're not putting all their eggs in one basket.
Exactly. They're keeping their options open, and it's the same thing with intelligence.
So what you're saying is they'll work with anybody.
If it's good for Serbia, absolutely. Remember that case we talked about? The Serbian military officer who was supposedly giving information to Russia?
Oh.
Well, that might have been connected to Serbia selling arms to Ukraine, so
Whoa.
It's all connected.
So they're playing both sides.
They're playing their own side.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. We've gone from these almost mythical stories of the UDBA, these ruthless enforcers, to modern-day Serbia playing this delicate game on the world stage. What have we learned? That the legacy of intelligence agencies, it doesn't just disappear. And that in a place like the Balkans, the past has never really passed. It's still shaping the present. It's definitely a story worth watching, especially with everything going on in Ukraine, with Russia,